And thank you to Hong Suk and to all of you for inviting me to be with you today, to share in worship, but also to share some reflections. It's a real privilege to be with you, and thank you so much. Relationships is a huge topic to talk about in relation to your work as elders. But I hope that my reflections tonight are something that have resonance for you in your lives, in your context that you're elders in, and in the discussions that we have both tonight and going forward. As Hong Suk explained, my role is as Director of Place for Hope, but my passion for peacemaking, for conflict transformation and non-violence is rooted very much in my Christian faith and in the journey I've taken with Jesus since the age of 18. And I'm just going to share my screen now with you. As well as being rooted very much in my faith, my experiences overseas, particularly in countries of mass violence and extreme poverty, have had a real influence, and is certainly even today the lens through which I look at most situations. The journeys that I've taken with people in those places, and what I've witnessed, but also the people I've lost in those places, and the journey that God has had with me through those times. So the reflections that I offer tonight are a reflection of both my work at Place for Hope, those experiences, and also the work that I've done in those places, both on health and mental health and well-being, because I think they all tied together. Just for those of you who, most of you I imagine will know of Place for Hope, but just in case some of you don't, just to understand who we are, we're a charity that actually came in as an initiative within the Church of Scotland. We became an independent charity in 2015, but our whole purpose is to accompany and equip people and faith communities so that we may all reach our potential to be peacemakers who can navigate conflict and change well. And is our hope and vision that every faith community can be places of hope, where we're all able to do 4 key things, both internally within our congregations, but also in our wider communities. Those 4 things are to be able to notice brokenness and division. Secondly, to nurture relationships and community. Thirdly, to navigate conflict and change with graciousness. And finally, to be able to nourish wholeness in themselves and in their communities. And I think it's that last one particularly that speaks to of this type of peace that we talk about at Place for Hope, the sort of shalom peace that Jesus spoke of in the Gospels, that sense of well-being and wholeness, of being able to flourish as God intended us to do, and that there is an end to brokenness and division, particularly in the relationships we have with God, with one another, with ourselves, and with the natural world. So that's the context for Place for Hope. But I think as we start to talk about relationships, for me, it's against a backdrop of what is going on in the world. And for many years, for me, I've had to look at trends. We live in extraordinary times, I think you would agree with me. And for those of us who see the world through the arc of history, we also live in very dangerous times. The COVID pandemic did not wreak havoc in a vacuum. It played out as all pandemics do, along the fault lines that already existed in society, affecting the most vulnerable and exacerbating the fears and divisions that have long laid below the surface, only erupting every now and again. It was my job for many years overseas and in consultations with governments around the world to look at trends. So even before COVID came along, we were seeing trends over the last 10, 15, 20 years Those trends you'll be all familiar with. We have seen a deterioration in the natural world. We are in a climate emergency. We saw that at the beginning of last year when we saw the fires in Australia, and thought things really couldn't get much worse than that. And then the year unraveled. We know we are losing species. We know that we are heading towards disaster if we don't change our ways. We're also seeing global trends towards exacerbating fears and stereotyping of people, different from ourselves, those dominant narratives that fill both our traditional and social media networks, and also the public discourse, whether it's political or otherwise, is about you're on one side of something or another. There is very little nuance or middle ground these days. We're also seeing trends, and although this is a very past picture in some ways, it's not in others. We're seeing trends towards austerity, towards populism, towards fascism even. Many issues of justice that have continued, some through centuries and some even beyond that, have been highlighted over these past decades, but have also come into their own over this past year and a half. Situations around the world, in comparison to where we are, have just continued to get worse. They are forgotten. Yemen being one of them, Syria, South Sudan, so many places in the world that are forgotten. And those are the ones that we actually have coming up on our newsreels. There are so many other places that I've worked in, I'm sure that many of you have heard of, that are just not even on the radar. We have an increase in terrorism. And for the first time, for a long time, we have an increase in wars, in internal conflicts, and in general violence, after a trend towards the end of the last century and the beginning of this century towards a decrease in violence. And those trends, even before COVID for me, always brought up an analogy of what I would call the sinkhole. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that natural phenomena. And it's an analogy that speaks to me, because in the natural world, sinkholes are quite normal. It's a depression in the ground where the surface just collapses. And it's caused because for a long period of time, there's been an erosion below the surface. And although it happens all around the world, we most notice it where human beings have built something, whether it's a bridge or a building or something on top of it, and then they collapse as well. But it's interesting to me because the signs before the collapse are words that often I recognize from our human society, that you can tell that there's something going on because there are cracks that are found in foundations and buildings before that collapse. There are depressions in the ground that you can see. There's words, depression, cracks. Trees and fence posts start to be off kilter. They start to bend one way or another. Doors and windows become difficult to open. Things are difficult. Those are all words that associate with so many of those trends. And I just want to read for you a short Bible passage from Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 to 27. And it comes at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. And so much that is in that sermon is about relationships, relationship with God, relationships with ourselves, relationships with each other, and how they can so easily become broken and how we can reconcile them. And at the end of all that teaching that Jesus brings about relationships, he says this: "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash. Whether we use the analogy of building on sand or the analogy of a sinkhole, we have over a period of time come to a place where so many people around the world don't know what is true or false. Fake news, who do we trust to get our information? And that has been a real issue over the past year as well. Trends towards social breakdown, the toxic environment of discourse in the public domain, the cancel culture. Even here in the UK, things are signs of deterioration. We have, over 2021, 2.5 million people accessing food banks, compared to, in 2008 and 9, 25,000. Those are trends that reflect shifts that we are building on sand, on sinkholes. And against that backdrop came COVID. And relationships in any crisis is a two-way stream. Crises require us to have strong relationships, to bond together, to get through things. But they also impact and cause stress and sometimes renting apart of relationships. We've all experienced COVID very differently. And I'm going to share a diagram now from the Episcopal Relief and Development Fund. It's something that we worked with a lot overseas. And I think it certainly has for me, in my experience of COVID over this last 15 months, had a lot of resonance. There's a lot of similarities I see in the way that we have gone up and down over time through the different phases of this crisis. And so I just wanted to share it with you today, whether it has resonance for you. There are some differences, though, in the COVID pandemic as opposed to many other types of crises, and it is to do with relationships, and I'll go through it with you. So, early and probably late 2019, early 2020, we were hearing sort of distant rumbles from China about a new virus, and it seemed a long way away for a lot of people. And then we started to think, okay, it's coming a bit closer. And we were told to wash our hands, we're told to be careful, people might be bringing it in. And then we hit that low spot. Okay, we went into that first lockdown. There was a scramble of personal need, making sure that we and our families had enough toilet paper. We were concerned about ourselves in that moment of absolute crisis. We were asked to stay home to protect the NHS, to save lives. And so once the immediate, we seem to have supplies in the supermarkets was over, we did what often happens in an acute crisis. We rose to the occasion. We started to, make sure our neighbours were okay. We started to find new ways to connect. We started to recognise those who were putting themselves on the line, both in NHS and in a whole swathe of jobs that actually helped us all to survive. We recognised and we honoured that. But we also, in our churches, we found new ways to be able to worship together, even online, even though that felt so strange a year ago. It's become so common now. We found ways of providing for people's needs outside our church doors. We probably did before, but to a much greater extent. We came together as communities, local communities and larger communities, to get done what was needed. We rose to the occasion in an acute crisis. But as what so often happens, once an acute phase is over, this crisis continues, we start to have things that whittle away at that, making that effort, whether it's people, in power, breaking the rules while the rest of us have to stick to them, or things like, sudden changes of plans, whether it was around Christmas or for people in the north of England around Eid al-Adha, sudden changes to expectations and plans starts to whittle away that sense of we're all in this together. And we entered a phase over winter that over 101 days saw 70,000 people die in this country of COVID. And we were in a lockdown that was different from the first. It was a lockdown where we were tired and we didn't have the energy that we had in that first lockdown. We didn't have the sense of I can be innovative. It was tiring. People wanted this to be over. It was quite a dark time. And I think, there was a sense for a lot of people, not everybody, that this was just getting more difficult. And that was the transition from acute to a chronic crisis. And in chronic crisis, we need different skills, different levels of resilience that are not the super sort of heroic ones of the first in acute crisis we rise to, but the solid, let's just do something each day. Let's get through this, the sort of putting your head down and getting through it. And as we started to emerge from the winter and restrictions have eased, there have been ups and downs for all of us, I'm sure. And in every up and down, this is an emotional roller coaster, but it is also a reflection of the ups and downs we have in our relationships. I'm sure that we have had highs in our relationship with God over this time, but also we've had struggles if we're in a house with a family, there's times when we wanted to be by ourselves. For people who have been living by themselves, there's been times it's just too silent in our homes. We're desperate to actually meet with people. We've all had different experiences and our relationships have gone up and down with our moods and our physical and mental health. We are not yet through this crisis. We still have an unknown ahead of us. And so we will continue to have these ups and downs, and it will continue to affect our relationships. Faith communities, as communities themselves, have gone through these as well as individuals, as we have. We not only go through emotional stages through disaster cycles, crisis cycles, but we embody that. It becomes physical as well as it becomes emotional and spiritual. We hold in our bodies chronic crises, whether we feel it as exhaustion or tiredness, particularly on some days, or whether we see it in ourselves with a low tolerance for things that we normally would put up with quite easily. In our productivity, in our own just sort of general health, we see all of those signs in ourselves. That's the embodiment of trauma. And I would say that in a national crisis, a global one that we've been through and are continuing to go through, the first step is really recognizing all of those things and being kind to where we are at and where other people are at. It's lovely in this phase where everybody just rallies and helps those that can't. But in a chronic phase, we need to recognize that we're going to go up and down quite a lot. This is sort of where I wanted to leave it for this first session. When we come back after the next break, we're going to look at where we're going ahead and what we can do to help relationships and reconciliation going forwards. But I hope that diagram and some of the conversations and reflections have been helpful for you in thinking through what this past period has been like, both internally and in your relationships with God, with yourself, with others, and in the world that we live in, because in some of those phases we have gotten to know nature better because it's been the only source of being out. I'd like to end, before we go to the break, with a prayer. It comes from the Corrymeela community, and it's a prayer for reconciliation. And the reason I choose reconciliation is because we're in a time of brokenness. Whether we individually feel that way or we can recognize it around us. So I'd just like to pray for this before we go to the break. Where there is separation, there is pain. And where there is pain, there is story. And where there is story, there is understanding and misunderstanding, listening and not listening. May we, separated peoples, estranged strangers, unfriended families, divided communities, turn toward each other and turn toward our stories with understanding and listening, with argument and acceptance, with challenge, change, and consolation. Because if God is to be found, God will be found in the space between. Amen. So what I'd really love us to do in this first breakout session, groups of 4 or 5, as I understand, is to take an opportunity to share with one another. We are not yet out of the crisis, but we can have reflections on whether in your small group to share and discuss whether any of the points that have been raised, any of the reflections in this first session have resonated with your own or your church's experience of this time of pandemic. And just take a time to share those stories and why they have resonated or have differed from, because other people will have different experiences from some of the examples I gave.